Thank you. I have another question. I'm not sure whether it was written by somebody from ConocoPhillips, but it says ConocoPhillips is considering selling its 9% stake in Syncrude. Would Exxon be interested?
You know, I have a small squadron of lawyers and so forth that tell me exactly what to say in times like this and any other deals that might come up. And what I would say is, you know, we continue to look at commercially interesting deals all around the world, Canada being no exception and so forth, but I can't comment on the particulars of any deal.
Thank you. What is ExxonMobil's view on using a carbon tax for sensible carbon policy?
It's an interesting subject, and one that a number of you might be familiar that we've spoken out on in recent months there. But before I get into the particulars, though, of a carbon tax, what I'd say is it's really important as we think about any solutions to climate change challenges from a legislative or a regulatory perspective that we really ground ourselves in the principles that should underpin whatever that solution is going to be. And what we say about those principles is that, you know, first, anything that's associated with carbon reduction, climate change improvement, and so forth, the policy really needs to establish parameters that are uniform and predictable so that industry and others can look at them and make sensible predictions. What we need to get away from a principle perspective, is a policy where government gets into the business of picking winners. And that has never worked in the past in any industry and any technology, and it won't work in the future. Secondly, the best way to ensure that carbon costs are minimized is to select the best new technologies through the workings of the market in that stable and uniform framework that I talked about earlier. The third thing that you need to consider in whatever the solution is we need to find something that minimizes administrative complexity, something that can be easily introduced and understood, doesn't introduce a whole new layer of bureaucracy, bureaucrats, costs, opaqueness, and so forth that makes it hard to understand. Fourthly, it needs to be transparent. Everybody involved in the solution from a policy perspective, be they an innovator, a producer, or a consumer, needs to be able to understand what the cost structure is and what they will ultimately bear when they make their decisions. As I said, whether they're a consumer or other ones. And finally, the fifth point would be, it has to be something that's applicable globally. So when you consider those five sort of principles for a policy, what we have concluded, and we've talked about recently, is, as much as we hate to say it as a business, carbon tax, straightforward carbon tax that's revenue neutral, makes more sense than any of the other policy options that are being floated now. As a number of you probably know, we've been a big investor in the technology of gas to liquids, and in fact, Mr. March was involved in that prior to coming up here in Canada. We have, in ExxonMobil, spent quite a bit to develop proprietary gas to liquids technology, demonstrated it on a small scale, and had discussions with a number of resource holders around the world about the right application for it. What I would tell you is it's a tool in the toolkit. There is probably an application somewhere in the world where it makes a lot of sense, but quite frankly, as gas use has advanced, and in particular, we've made a lot of advances in LNG, or liquefied natural gas, particularly on technology and scale and so forth, it's harder and harder to see a niche for gas to liquids is the right answer for a resource holder in terms of getting the most value. It is still more capital intensive than LNG or other uses of the gas there. So we'll continue to look for opportunities, and we do have a great technology available, but I can't tell you that I can predict when and if it might be used in the near term.
I have a couple of questions asking you to comment a bit more on the U.S. approach to climate change. I know you covered the carbon tax, but just in general, we've seen the Waxman-Markey bill, and we've seen some references to maybe moving some of the regulations over to the EPA. Where do you see that going in general?
Well, I'd be foolish to make predictions on the whims of politicians, but what you're seeing unfold right now in the U.S. is a dynamic where there's been a tension, and I think intentionally created, between the legislative side, the Congress, and the administration, which oversees the regulatory bodies, and it's designed to force an outcome. That is to say, the legislative bodies have been incented by the administration and indeed by their constituents to advance solutions for climate change, the Waxman-Markey bill being one of the more recent ones, and more recently the Senate version, somewhat similar there. But the administration also is incenting in the sense of brandishing a stick, using the EPA to potentially regulate carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, under provisions contained in the Clean Air Act of 1990, legislation passed obviously a long time ago there. How that tension between whether the stick of a regulatory application is used to get a legislative solution or the legislative solution unfolds by itself, it's hard to tell what the outcome is. In both cases, I would go back and say, my wish would be that the policymakers, the opinion leaders, the legislators, the politicians, and so forth, would go back and back to the principles, back to first principles. I've articulated 5 earlier. There are other variations they might wish to pursue, and say, is what we're doing really grounded in these principles? Is what we're doing going to allow for the continued development of more energy that's required around the world to make people's lives better, to lift people out of poverty, as I said before? Are our policies, wherever they are, going to allow that to happen, allow more energy to be developed, while at the same time, in an economic way, reducing the emissions associated with the energy use? That's the real fundamental question. Whenever people come up with these ideas, or the bills or the regulations and so forth, they need to really play it forward, like the studies that the School of Public Policy does, and say, what is this going to do to us? Is it going to curtail growth in energy supply, and thus the ability to move forward economic development and so forth? Is it really going to do anything about emissions? We really need to go back to principles, really need to undertake the right kind of analysis that says, yes, if we do this, beyond the doing this, we've got something that works in the long term. And most importantly, as I said before, we've got something that allows people out there, companies out there, entrepreneurs out there to innovate solutions that we can't even conceive of at this moment to solve that dual challenge of producing more energy and reducing the environmental impact.